Most people think their day begins when the noise begins, when the phone lights up, the clock starts demanding, and the world rushes in with its opinions, pressures, and urgencies. But that assumption is profoundly mistaken. Your day does not begin when activity begins. It begins when awareness begins. The first moments after you wake are not neutral. They are formative. They are the quiet intersection where the eternal brushes against the immediate, where direction is chosen long before motion is visible. Mornings are not merely a slice of time, they are a strategic threshold. In those early minutes, your mind is impressionable, your defenses are down, and your values are either reinforced or quietly compromised. Whatever claims your attention first is subtly granted authority. It becomes the reference point from which every decision, reaction, and interpretation will flow. If you surrender that sacred opening to randomness, you should not be surprised when the rest of the day feels fragmented and reactive. But if you steward it with intention, anchoring your thoughts, calibrating your priorities, and aligning your inner compass, you establish a framework that governs everything that follows. This is not about becoming more productive, it is about becoming more precise. Because when the morning is ordered, the day is no longer at the mercy of circumstance, it is guided by purpose. Mornings are the hinge of the day, the quiet pivot on which everything else turns, whether we acknowledge it or not. Long before the first conversation, the first decision, or the first demand is placed upon you, something decisive has already occurred internally. Direction has been chosen. Orientation has been set. The tone of the day has been established in ways that are largely invisible but deeply influential. What follows in the visible hours is often nothing more than the unfolding of what was silently decided in the unseen ones. A hinge is a small thing. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It doesn't dominate the structure, yet the entire movement of a door depends on it. If the hinge is misaligned, the door grinds, sticks, or refuses to close properly. If the hinge is secure and correctly set, the door moves smoothly, almost effortlessly. In the same way, the morning determines whether the day opens with clarity or resistance, with purpose or friction. People tend to blame the weight of the door, the workload, the stress, the circumstances, when in reality, the problem lies at the hinge. The unseen decisions of the morning are not always dramatic. They are subtle agreements made with distraction, impatience, fear, or haste. They are the choice to begin the day reacting rather than directing, absorbing rather than discerning. When the first moments of consciousness are surrendered to noise, the soul quietly consents to being managed by whatever shouts the loudest. That consent shapes every response that follows. By midday, the individual feels overwhelmed, not realizing the day was already lost before it began. There is a reason the earliest moments carry such weight. The mind, fresh from rest, is not yet cluttered with arguments or defensive postures. It is receptive, it is open, it is impressionable. Whatever fills it first tends to frame everything else. This is why mornings are not simply about habits, but about authority. Who or what is granted the right to speak first? That question is answered not in theory, but in practice, every single day. When mornings are neglected, life becomes reactive by default. Decisions are made under pressure rather than conviction. Emotions are triggered rather than examined. Priorities are dictated by urgency instead of significance. People then wonder why they feel as though they are constantly behind, constantly responding, constantly adjusting to a world that seems to control them. The truth is uncomfortable but liberating. The chaos of the day is often the echo of an unguarded morning. Conversely, when the morning is intentionally ordered, something remarkable happens. The day does not become easier, but it becomes clearer. Challenges still arise, but they no longer define the internal climate. External pressures lose some of their power because the inner framework has already been established. The individual is no longer improvising their values in real time. They are operating from a pre-established alignment. This is not about rigid routines or aesthetic rituals. It is about recognizing that the first conscious moments are a governance issue. They determine who is in charge for the rest of the day. If the morning is ruled by impulse, the day will follow suit. If the morning is ruled by intention, the day will reflect that discipline. The hinge determines the arc. Many people attempt to repair their lives at the level of outcomes, changing schedules, environments, or strategies, without ever addressing the hinge. They treat symptoms while ignoring structure. But transformation does not begin with acceleration. It begins with alignment. And alignment is established before the world has had a chance to interfere. When you understand the morning as the hinge of the day, you stop treating it casually. You begin to protect it. You recognize that even small, consistent acts of intention at the start can redirect the entire trajectory of your life over time. The door will still be heavy, the world will still apply pressure, but when the hinge is set correctly, the movement is no longer a struggle. It becomes a deliberate opening into a day that is guided, not driven. The first moments of consciousness are not an empty corridor you merely pass through on your way to the day. They are a workshop where the tools of perception are quietly assembled. Before you speak to anyone, before you touch a task, before you interpret a single event, your inner world is already being tuned. Thought patterns are being primed, expectations are being formed, and assumptions about the coming hours are taking shape. This happens whether you are deliberate or careless, attentive or distracted. The only question is who is doing the tuning. When you wake, your mind is in a rare state. It has not yet armored itself against resistance or cluttered itself with justifications. It is neither fully guarded nor fully scattered. In that brief window, beliefs slip in more easily than they will at any other point in the day. If the first voice it hears is anxiety, then anxiety becomes the default interpreter of events. If the first stimulus is urgency, then everything that follows will feel late, pressured, and insufficient. If the first influence is resentment, comparison, or fear, those lenses will quietly color every interaction that comes afterward. This is why people often misjudge their own reactions later in the day. They think they are responding to circumstances as they are, when in fact they are responding through a filter that was installed hours earlier. The morning sets that filter. It determines whether you see obstacles or assignments, interruptions or opportunities, threats or tests. By the time the external situation arises, the internal verdict has often already been rendered. The tragedy is that many surrender this critical moment without resistance. They invite noise into the mind before truth has a chance to speak. They allow the unresolved concerns of yesterday or the imagined pressures of tomorrow to rush in and claim authority. In doing so, they hand over interpretive power to forces that do not have their best interests in mind. The day then becomes a series of reactions to impressions that were never examined. Once a lens is set, it resists change. Throughout the day, the mind will unconsciously seek evidence to confirm what it has already assumed. A negative word will be magnified, while a positive one is dismissed. A delay will be interpreted as failure rather than timing. A challenge will feel personal rather than purposeful. This is not because reality has changed, but because perception has been narrowed. And perception, once narrowed, governs behavior with quiet authority. If, however, the first moments are governed by intention rather than impulse, the effect is equally powerful in the opposite direction. When the mind is anchored early, when it is reminded of truth, perspective, and purpose, it carries that calibration forward. The same circumstances arise, but they are processed differently. Pressure no longer dictates panic. Uncertainty does not immediately produce fear. Decisions are filtered through clarity instead of haste. This is not about denying difficulty or pretending everything is easy. It is about determining which voice gets to define what difficulty means. When the morning is used to establish meaning rather than absorb noise, the individual gains a kind of quiet authority. They are not immune to stress, but they are not enslaved by it either. Their reactions are slower, more measured, and more aligned with who they intend to be. Most people underestimate how much of their life is lived through interpretation rather than direct experience. Two individuals can face the same event and walk away with entirely different outcomes, not because the event changed, but because the lens did. That lens is rarely formed in the heat of the moment, it is shaped beforehand. The morning is where that shaping most effectively occurs. To ignore this is to live at the mercy of whatever impression happens to arrive first. To understand it is to reclaim a form of sovereignty over your inner world. The morning does not guarantee success or prevent hardship, but it determines how you will understand both. And in the end, understanding governs response, response shapes habit, and habit quietly builds a life. What enters the mind at the beginning of the day does more than occupy attention. It establishes a reference point. From that reference point, everything else is measured, evaluated, and interpreted. The first input becomes the silent standard by which subsequent thoughts are weighed. This is why the opening moments of the morning are never neutral. They are foundational. They decide what feels normal, what feels threatening, and what feels worth pursuing for the next 16 hours. The human mind is not a passive container, but an interpretive system. It is constantly asking questions, even when you are not aware of them. What matters? What should I fear? What deserves my energy? The answers are rarely spoken aloud, but they are inferred from whatever is given priority. When the first priority is noise, urgency, or comparison, the mind concludes that survival, speed, and self-measurement are the highest values. From there, every experience is filtered through competition, anxiety, and haste. This is why beginning the day immersed in disorder almost guarantees a sense of disorder later. The mind learns what kind of world it is operating in by what it encounters first. If the first signals are fragmented and frantic, the internal map of reality becomes the same. Even moments of calm later in the day will feel temporary or suspicious because they do not match the established reference point. Once that internal standard is set, it functions like a lens on a camera. You do not see the lens, but you see everything through it. Details that fit the lens come into sharp focus, while those that do not are blurred or ignored. If the lens is pessimism, setbacks become proof of futility. If the lens is impatience, delays feel intolerable. If the lens is fear, uncertainty becomes a threat rather than a field of possibility. The tragedy is that people often believe they are seeing reality as it is, never realizing how much of it is being edited. The morning determines which lens is installed. Later attempts to adjust perception are far more difficult because the mind has already organized itself around that early framework. Throughout the day, attention will gravitate toward whatever confirms the original orientation. This is not a conscious conspiracy of thought. It is the mind's efficiency at work. It prefers consistency to accuracy, coherence to truth. The morning provides the template for that consistency. If, however, the first input of the day is intentional, the reference point shifts. When the mind is grounded in perspective, gratitude, or meaning early on, it begins the day with a wider field of vision. Problems are still recognized, but they are placed within a larger context. Pressure is still felt, but it does not define identity. Success and failure are no longer ultimate measures, but data points within a longer trajectory. This does not make a person detached or indifferent. On the contrary, it often makes them more engaged. When the lens is clear, energy is not wasted on unnecessary emotional reactions. Focus sharpens, discernment increases, the individual becomes less susceptible to manipulation by circumstances or other people's expectations because their internal compass has already been set. Many spend years trying to change their lives by altering external factors, new environments, new relationships, new strategies, while neglecting the internal lens through which those factors are viewed. The result is predictable. The scenery changes, but the experience does not. The same frustrations reappear in new forms because the reference point remains unchanged. Without recalibrating the lens, the mind will continue to reproduce familiar patterns, regardless of how different things appear on the surface. The morning offers a daily opportunity to reset that lens. It is a chance to decide consciously what will define reality for the coming hours. This decision does not require dramatic gestures or elaborate routines. It requires awareness and restraint, the willingness to delay exposure to noise long enough to establish meaning. That small act of discipline can quietly reshape perception in ways that compound over time. In the end, life is not merely a sequence of events, but a sequence of interpretations. Those interpretations guide choices, shape emotions, and solidify habits. The lens you look through today will become the worldview you live from tomorrow. And more often than not, that lens is chosen in the first moments after you wake. Discipline in the morning is often misunderstood as a matter of rigid scheduling, aesthetic routines, or personal optimization. In reality, it has very little to do with efficiency and everything to do with alignment. The question the morning answers is not, how much can I accomplish today, but from what center will I operate? Without that center, activity becomes motion without meaning, effort without direction. Alignment implies that there is something to align with, a purpose, a set of values, a hierarchy of priorities that exists independent of mood or circumstance. The morning is the one portion of the day least contaminated by external demands, which makes it uniquely suited for this calibration. Before the world begins its negotiations, the individual has an opportunity to reaffirm what truly governs their decisions. When that opportunity is ignored, governance does not disappear. It is simply transferred to whatever force is most immediate and insistent. Many people live under the illusion that they are free because they are busy, yet busyness often conceals a deeper form of captivity, the inability to choose what truly matters. The morning reveals this more clearly than any other time. If the first act of the day is to submit attention to demands, notifications, or unresolved anxieties, then alignment has already been forfeited. The day will proceed, but it will proceed under borrowed priorities. True discipline at dawn is not about adding more tasks, but about subtracting confusion. It is the deliberate narrowing of focus to what is foundational before engaging with what is urgent. This act of narrowing is uncomfortable for those accustomed to stimulation because it requires stillness and honesty. In that stillness, misalignment becomes visible, motives are examined, assumptions are questioned. The individual is confronted with the gap between who they intend to be and how they have been living. This confrontation is precisely why many avoid intentional mornings. Noise provides cover. Activity creates the illusion of progress. But alignment cannot be rushed, and it cannot be outsourced. It requires attention, reflection, and a willingness to let certain priorities fall away. The morning, by its nature, invites this process. It does not demand productivity, it demands presence. When alignment is established early, discipline throughout the day becomes less about willpower and more about consistency. Decisions are easier because the criteria have already been defined. Temptations lose some of their force because they are evaluated against a known standard rather than momentary desire. Even failure is processed differently, not as a collapse of identity, but as feedback within an ongoing pursuit of coherence. Without this alignment, discipline degenerates into self-control alone, which is both exhausting and unreliable. Willpower, when disconnected from purpose, eventually fractures under pressure. People then interpret this fracture as personal weakness, when in fact it is structural failure. They were attempting to enforce behavior without first establishing meaning. The morning corrects this by restoring order at the level of intention. It allows the individual to step back from the immediacy of tasks and remember why those tasks exist in the first place. This remembrance is not sentimental, it is strategic. It frames the day within a larger narrative, giving weight to patience and restraint while diminishing the authority of impulse. Alignment also creates a kind of internal integrity. When actions flow from clearly defined values, there is less internal conflict. Energy is conserved because it is not being spent on constant self-negotiation. The person becomes more reliable, not only to others but to themselves. Over time, this reliability builds trust, an often overlooked but essential component of personal authority. To neglect the morning is to allow misalignment to compound. Small deviations from purpose accumulate, and over time they become habits that feel natural but produce dissatisfaction. People then search for solutions at the level of circumstance, unaware that the root issue is directional, not situational. The disciplined morning is therefore not a luxury or a personal preference. It is a daily act of governance. It is where values are reaffirmed, direction is clarified, and the inner compass is reset. When this alignment is established, the day may still be demanding, but it is no longer disordered. Action flows from meaning, not pressure. And in that flow, discipline ceases to feel like restraint and begins to function as freedom. Silence in the morning is not merely the absence of sound, it is the absence of interference. It creates a space where thought can settle, where the inner noise that accumulates through constant exposure has a chance to dissipate. In that space, something rare becomes possible. Discernment. Discernment is not information and it is not intelligence. It is the ability to perceive what matters most beneath what is merely loud. The morning, when protected by intentional quiet, becomes a training ground for this capacity. Most people assume clarity comes from acquiring more input, more data, more opinions, more updates, yet clarity is more often the result of subtraction. When the mind is bombarded from the moment it wakes, it remains in a defensive posture. It scans rather than reflects, reacts rather than evaluates. In that state, everything feels equally urgent, equally important, equally demanding. Discernment cannot operate under such conditions because it requires perspective, and perspective requires space. Silence provides that space. It slows the internal tempo just enough for deeper patterns to emerge. Thoughts that were previously buried under urgency surface. Motives that went unquestioned reveal themselves. This is not always comfortable. Quiet has a way of exposing misalignment and unresolved tension. That discomfort is precisely why silence is often avoided. Noise offers distraction, and distraction offers temporary relief from self-examination. Yet without this early stillness, the day unfolds on autopilot. Decisions are made based on habit rather than insight. Opportunities are missed because they do not announce themselves loudly enough. Warnings are ignored because they do not align with existing momentum. The individual remains busy but directionally blind, moving quickly without seeing clearly. When silence is embraced in the morning, it sharpens perception. It trains the mind to notice nuance, to recognize the difference between urgency and importance. This skill carries forward into the day. Conversations are heard more accurately. Situations are assessed more calmly. Reactions are delayed just long enough to allow wisdom to intervene. What appears later as composure or insight often has its roots in those early moments of quiet. Focus is the companion of silence. Without focus, silence can become emptiness or drifting thought. With focus, it becomes intentional attention. The morning is uniquely suited for this because attention has not yet been fragmented by competing demands. To focus early is to practice choosing one thing over many, depth over breadth, meaning over motion. This choice reinforces the ability to remain centered when distractions inevitably arise later. Spiritual sensitivity, however one defines it, also depends on this pairing of silence and focus. When the internal environment is cluttered, subtle promptings are drowned out. Insight that requires patience is overlooked in favor of immediate gratification. The individual becomes less responsive to guidance that does not conform to existing plans. Over time, this dulls awareness, not because guidance has ceased, but because receptivity has diminished. The morning, approached with intentional quiet, reverses this dulling. It reopens channels of perception that have been narrowed by constant stimulation. It reminds the individual that not all truth arrives loudly and not all direction demands speed. Some of the most consequential realizations arrive gently, requiring attentiveness rather than effort. This sharpening effect compounds over time. A single quiet morning may offer limited insight, but a pattern of silence cultivates discernment as a habit. The mind learns to pause before concluding, to listen before responding, to weigh before acting. This habit becomes an internal filter, protecting against manipulation and impulsivity. The individual becomes less reactive, not because they care less, but because they see more. In a world that equates noise with relevance and speed with success, the disciplined quiet of the morning appears unproductive. Yet it is precisely this apparent inefficiency that produces depth. Depth in understanding, depth in character, depth in decision-making. Those who neglect this depth often compensate with volume and urgency, mistaking activity for effectiveness. The morning silence does not remove complexity from life, but it equips the individual to navigate it. It establishes a posture of listening rather than grasping, of seeing rather than rushing. From that posture, discernment emerges, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady, reliable capacity. And once that capacity is formed, it quietly governs the day, guiding choices in ways that are subtle, consistent, and profoundly influential. Chaos rarely arrives without warning. It is usually invited incrementally through small acts of neglect that seem insignificant at the time. One of the most common of these is the careless beginning of the day. When the morning is treated as disposable, the rest of the day often bears the consequences. Disorder later is not random, it is the delayed outcome of an unexamined start. Neglect in the morning does not always look like obvious failure. More often, it appears as haste, a rushed awakening, an immediate immersion into demands, a reflexive surrender of attention to whatever presents itself first. These choices feel practical, even necessary, but they quietly establish a pattern, reaction over intention. Once that pattern is set, the day follows it faithfully. By the time complications arise later, miscommunications, poor decisions, emotional volatility, they feel sudden and unprovoked, yet they are the harvest of seeds planted hours earlier. The mind, having never been centered, remains fragmented. The emotions, having never been ordered, fluctuate wildly. The priorities, having never been clarified, compete with one another. Chaos, in this sense, is not an external assault, but an internal condition. When the morning is neglected, the individual begins the day already behind. Not behind in tasks, but behind in orientation. They are responding to events without a framework, improvising values in real time. Under pressure, This improvisation defaults to impulse and habit. Old patterns reassert themselves not because they are desired, but because they are familiar. The individual feels as though they are constantly catching up, yet never quite arriving. This internal disorder expresses itself outwardly. Conversations become reactive. Decisions are rushed or avoided altogether. Minor setbacks feel catastrophic because there is no internal buffer to absorb them. The day becomes a series of emergencies, many of which are exaggerated by the absence of early grounding. What could have been handled with calm precision instead triggers frustration or fear. In contrast, when the morning is attended to with care, it functions as a stabilizing force. It does not eliminate unexpected events, but it prepares the individual to meet them without losing coherence. Order established early acts like ballast in a vessel. It keeps the system steady even when conditions are rough. The absence of that ballast makes even small waves feel overwhelming. People often attempt to address chaos by managing symptoms. They adopt new tools, reorganize schedules, or seek external solutions. While these can be helpful, they rarely resolve the root issue. The problem is not a lack of technique, but a lack of internal order. Without that order, any system eventually degrades under pressure. The morning is where that internal order is most effectively established. It is the one moment in the day when the individual can choose coherence before complexity. To ignore that moment is to defer order until it is too late, attempting to impose structure on a day already in motion. This is far more difficult than setting direction at the outset. Chaos thrives on fragmentation. It feeds on divided attention and unresolved priorities. A neglected morning provides both. The mind is pulled in multiple directions, and none of them are examined. By the time clarity is sought, the day is already crowded with commitments and consequences. The opportunity for deliberate choice has passed. Attending to the morning does not require perfection. It requires presence. A few moments of intentional grounding can prevent hours of unnecessary turmoil. By acknowledging the day before it begins, by choosing orientation before action, the individual reduces the likelihood of cascading disorder. Small acts of attention at the start have disproportionate effects later on. Over time, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Days that begin in haste tend to end in exhaustion. Days that begin in clarity tend to end in resolve, even if they are demanding. This is not coincidence, it is causality. The beginning sets conditions that the rest of the day must obey. To understand this is to recognize responsibility without condemnation. The goal is not to control every outcome, but to steward the starting point. Chaos will still visit, but it will no longer reign. When the morning is honored, disorder loses its advantage. The day may still be challenging, but it will not be ungoverned. And that difference, repeated consistently, reshapes not just individual days, but the trajectory of a life. A redeemed morning is more than a routine completed or a checklist followed. It is a decisive statement of sovereignty over the day. When the first moments are consciously stewarded, the individual demonstrates an ability to choose rather than be chosen by circumstance. That choice is subtle, almost imperceptible to an observer, yet its consequences are profound and enduring. It transforms the day from a reactive sequence into a deliberate unfolding aligned with purpose. To redeem the morning is to recognize it as a sacred threshold. It is a period of potential that, once lost, cannot be fully recovered. Many people allow it to pass unexamined, immediately surrendering attention to external pressures, trivial concerns, or unfiltered impulses. In doing so, they grant authority over their day to forces that neither understand nor care about their highest good. They respond to the loudest or most immediate stimuli rather than the ones that are truly consequential. What could have been a guided, intentional day becomes a fragmented series of reactions, small victories overshadowed by subtle derailments. When the morning is redeemed, the individual sets a tone of alignment. Priorities are clarified before demands compete for attention. Thoughts are arranged before confusion intervenes. Emotional responses are framed by principle rather than impulse. In this way, the morning becomes a training ground, conditioning the mind and heart to respond with purpose rather than reflex. Over time, this conditioning accumulates into a form of resilience. Challenges still arise, but the individual is prepared internally to meet them without being swept away. Redeeming the morning is not primarily about productivity, it is about establishing governance over one's inner world. Every day begins with a choice, to be shaped by circumstance or to shape it. The redeemed morning asserts authority quietly but effectively. It establishes that values, intentions, and clarity are not negotiable. They are the ground from which all action springs. The rest of the day, no matter how unpredictable, moves within the parameters set during those early hours. The power of this practice compounds over time. A single morning lived with intentionality may produce temporary benefits, but repeated mornings create patterns. Those patterns shape perception, influence behavior, and determine emotional and spiritual responsiveness. The individual becomes less susceptible to manipulation, more attuned to what truly matters, and increasingly capable of prioritizing long-term good over short-term convenience. Life does not feel chaotic because it has been preemptively ordered. Decisions are no longer made in haste, and reactions are no longer dictated by the loudest voice or the sharpest pressure. Redeemed mornings cultivate discipline, but not as an end in itself. Discipline becomes a natural extension of alignment. When values are clarified, when priorities are settled, and when attention is focused, action flows with minimal friction. The individual does not need to rely on willpower alone, which is often fleeting and unreliable. Instead, the structure of intentional mornings guides behavior, making consistency less a matter of effort and more a matter of design. This is also a spiritual matter. The quiet, intentional, disciplined morning opens the soul to reflection, insight, and awareness that are otherwise crowded out by the noise of daily life. Sensitivity to guidance, clarity of conscience, and awareness of opportunity are sharpened when the mind and heart begin the day in alignment. The redeemed morning trains the soul to respond rather than react, to perceive rather than merely see, and to engage rather than merely exist. People often underestimate the significance of this practice because the benefits are not always immediately visible. The effects are cumulative and often subtle, yet they are undeniable. Over time, mornings redeemed consistently produce days lived with intentionality and a life shaped less by chance and more by choice. The individual becomes a master of small beginnings, understanding that even the largest outcomes often hinge on the first, quiet decisions made in the earliest hours. Ultimately, a redeemed morning transforms more than the day. It transforms the individual. It trains the mind, fortifies the heart, and anchors the spirit. It turns reaction into discernment, impulse into intention, and chaos into order. By reclaiming the first moments, a person learns to reclaim their life, one day at a time. Repeated faithfully, this practice establishes a rhythm that quietly but inexorably governs not just individual days, but the trajectory of an entire life, demonstrating that how we begin often determines how we endure, how we grow, and how we succeed.